Practicing joinery by hand or with machines is one of the key skill builders that's going to make you a better woodworker. It helps you get out of jams when you have some situation that you don't know how to solve with, your router or some big machine. You can get in there with a chisel or a saw and solve the problem. So today I put together a video of our 10 best Joint of the Week videos that you can enjoy as a compilation. So tell me which one's your favorite down in the comments and please enjoy. All right, guys, we have to talk. Last week, for Joint of the Week, I did this mitered dovetail corner is what we called it. And as many of you pointed out, yes, that is a weak joint. So we're gonna rectify that this week. And we're gonna do a few things that I wanted to change, which was I wanted to do some inlay. I wanted to make these tails a little bit shorter. And obviously I want to put a spline. So we're going to put an ebony spline in there. We're going to inlay some purple heart and then again use the lace wood for the corner, which was also a big question from last week. And I know, guys, sometimes we like to experiment on Joint of the Week. I made a weak one. In fact, my favorite comment was that should be called the Pretty Little Liar. So let's make up for it and do one that's really strong. Now, unlike last week's Joint of the Week, we want the inlay part of our tails to be bigger, much bigger than the maple, because we're gonna have to cut them twice. So we're gonna go ahead and mark those out and make sure that they're bigger than our maple tails. Another thing that I really wanted to do too was make the tails shorter. So we're gonna, last week I did that at about 5/8, and we need to obviously add in for our inlay, which is gonna be about an 1/8 thick. So I'm gonna do 3/8. Good little tip here is all good rulers are going to have indents where the measurements are, so you can quite literally put your marking gauge right in the indent and use it to set it. And I'll just click right in there. And again, these are just going to be tails. We're only doing tails, no pins on this one. We're going to decide how thick our inlay. I think for me, I'm going to do a 1/16 of an inch. And so very simply, I'm just going to take a ruler here and put my marking knife at a 1/16 of an inch. Take a square. For cutting purposes, we're going to take that line down. Now we're going to go ahead and cut off both sides on the table saw. All right, so now that we've identified the size of our inlay, it's time to figure out where we're gonna cut. So what I like to do is I'll take my ruler and just measure in a 1/16 and put my marking knife right there. And I'll take a square and just go straight across. Now we need to mark out our depth. And what's great about doing inlay this way is because you cut a 1/16 up this way or whatever it is, you don't need to change your marking gauge. It's gonna be the exact same. So we're just gonna go ahead and I'm just gonna go across my tails here just so I don't have to sand too much later. Especially because this is all really hard wood. So now we're going to lay out the tails for our corner piece. And when you're doing this, you do not need to change your marking gauge. Your marking gauge is not going to change on this step because it's still right there, right at that same level. If you wanted to, you could adjust it by maybe like a hair's width, which would give you a little bit more breathing room in there. One of the things I learned on this step here was that I should have used a little bit more glue when I was gluing the Purple Heart in. It was really hard and to chisel, and it kept breaking out, so I had to re-glue it, which is, you know, typical of inlaid dovetails. It's sometimes tough to get the inlay to stick around, but I really do wish I'd used more glue. So we're gonna go ahead and lay this out same as before. We're gonna create a fence, push it up against, and then very carefully lay it out, making sure that when you look down in between, there's just, you see like just the light starting to peek through, not even fully see through it, just that you can see that you're right there on the edge. So we're gonna start out by marking out both sides of this. And this is going to have a half tail of waste, so you do need to go around the edges. So let's get these marked out and cut and fit together. Okay, now that we have our inlay done, it's time to do our final milling. And what I mean by that is when you do dovetails, especially 4 sets of them, you know, things can get a little twisted this way or this way. And so it's time to do a final milling. And if this was a box, you would want to do all pieces, make sure they're the same width and thickness. And so what I'm going to do, I'm going to just cut this down the middle, doesn't matter where, and then I'm going to go ahead and mill these separately, because sometimes what can happen with dovetails is, you know, each piece is canted out, you know, 0.05 degrees, and then if you try and joint this as one piece, you could end up losing a lot of materials, because really you want to take off the minimal amount of material here. So we're going to cut it down the middle, and then we're going to joint and plane it again. You could use a hand plane very easily, or go through your machines. We might use the drum sander. And then we're going to cut our 45-degree angles. And when I cut my 45-degree angle, I'm going to come right off the corner of this, and then we're going to go ahead and cut in our splines. And our splines we're going to do at the router table, so I'll check back in with you there. Here's where we're going to put in this really cool ebony spline, and this is what I got a lot of grief about last week, was that I didn't reinforce this miter. So we're going to not only reinforce it, but we're going to do it in a super cool decorative way. So I have this ebony spline that is a 1/4 inch by 1/4 inch. I've got a 1/4 inch upcut bit in my router table, and it is set to, I believe, about 0.3 high. And what I did was I started at a 1/4 inch, and I ran some test pieces here until I got a perfect fit. And the way you know you'll have a perfect fit is that the ebony corners line up perfectly with the corner of what you've routed out there. So normally you would want to use a miter gauge for this, but I obviously don't on this wing of my table saw. So we're going to be using a sacrificial board to push these through so that we don't get any tear out in the back. And then we'll go ahead and glue this up and put some lacquer on it and see how freaking cool it looks. Wow, guys, that came out amazing. I really like the look of the one we did last week, but you guys were right. I was lazy. I should have put some way to reinforce that miter. And boy, do I think we've rectified this. The inlay looks so cool. The ebony is such a cool design feature. When you sort of look down from the top, it really just adds a really cool decoration to it. There's lots of ways you could improve on that. You could make it proud, and that could support your lid. So your lid had like a little shadow line, or you could make it a lidless box, you know, some sort of coffee table decoration, that sort of thing. But it has a very Aztec look to it. I love the lacewood, the maple, and the purple heart together. They really are just great contrast to each other. And again, this is what Joint of the Week is about. We learned something last week, we improved on it this week, and we're making joinery that we're proud of. And this is one that takes a lot of patience, because putting tails on top of tails is really hard to mark out. It's really hard to make them fit, and it was really an exercise in precision. So guys, thank you for watching. Stay safe in the shop. Have a wonderful day, and subscribe if you're new here. Thanks a lot, guys. What's up, guys? On this week's Joint of the Week, I want to do something a little bit different. I'm going to tell you everything I know about dovetails. Every tip, trick, every little shortcut, everything I've learned over the years on how to cut dovetails. And in fact, I'm doing a dovetail challenge over on Instagram where I'm giving away a Lee Nielsen rabbiting block plane, some Stanley chisels, a dovetail saw, some jigs, and it's going to be judged, I just found this out, by Chris over at Third Coast Craftsman. I'm so excited. He's become a good friend of mine. We've got some things in the works that we're going to be working on together, but he's going to be judging it over on Instagram. There'll be a link right down here below. You can go check out that contest and win this beautiful $400 dovetail prize pack. So let's get into the dovetails. And the first thing that's really important is that you mill your material. It doesn't have to be the same thickness, but it does have to be square. Has to be square. And so make sure when you're milling that the two mating faces are square to each other. The next step is we're going to head over to the table saw. I'm going to show you a little trick for hiding the inside of your dovetails. So the first step when you're doing dovetails is decide where your pins and tails are going to be. So we're just going to label these boards. This is going to be T for tails, P for pins. Sometimes when I'm doing a box, I'll do PA and TA and TB and PB, and that way I know which goes where. But one of the things I always like to do if I'm using the same type of wood is I do the grain match. So you can see this grain lines up perfectly here. Now, the first thing that I always do when cutting dovetails is I cut a little rabbet into my tails board. And what this does, it allows you to hide the inside of your tails, because sometimes you'll get a little blowout along that line, or it won't be that clean. So if you do a rabbet, not only does it give you a 90-degree reference here, but it also can hide the inside of your pins and tails and makes your box look a lot cleaner. So we're going to use our marking gauge here to set the depth of that rabbet, and that is always going to be the width of your other board. So all I do is I just put my marking gauge on top of my board here, lock it down, and then I just check and make sure that it is correct, and it is. I'm going to micro adjust it a little bit on the wide side, so that way it'll, instead of it being proud, it'll be the opposite of proud. I can't think of that right now. So what that means, because it's our tail board, we're going to mark all the way around the board. And pin board, you only mark the face and the rear. And now one thing to remember when you do this is that your marking gauge is going to be a different size when you switch, because you cut this rabbet, you're actually going to decrease the width of where your dovetails are going to go, so you need to remember to change your marking gauge when you go to the other board. Now we need to decide how deep into the board we're going to go. Honestly, I don't have a formula for this. What I do is I just do a little one. So, I don't know, 1/8 of an inch or so. And so, because these are our faces, I know that this is just going to go around my board like this. And I mark all of these faces. That way you can see exactly where it is when you're cutting and creating the rabbet. So I'm gonna go ahead and cut this out using a table saw. It's best to use a flat bottom blade, but I don't have one that's sharp right now. So we're gonna use our forest blade and then clean it up with a rabbiting plane. So before we get into this, let's talk about the tools you need and the tools that are great to have. So mandatory to cut dovetails is a dovetail saw, a marking gauge, a marking knife, some sort of mallet, a square, and some chisels. Now, that will get the job done. Now, here's some tools I think that make it easier. Obviously, a dovetail jig, the Katz-Moses dovetail jig specifically. Skew chisels, so chisels that have an angle on them are great for getting into corners. Again, not needed, but helpful. And then a pair of dividers. These dividers help you in marking out, but you don't need them. You can use a ruler and mark out your dovetails just evenly spaced, or however you want to space them. But this is a great way for marking them out. Let me show you how I use this. So the way I use my dividers is I measure the board. So we're at just a little over 3 3/4. So I'm going to set it to 1/3 of that, which is 1 1/4. And that's going to give me 1/8 inch wide pins here in the middle. And I walk the dividers along, starting at the edge, and then go to the other edge, walk them along. And now that leaves me with 2 pins and 3 tails, but I haven't accounted for the half pins yet. So what I'm going to do, take my dividers and set them to 1/8 of an inch by placing my divider right there on my square. Now, a good combo square is going to have indents at all the numbers. So I can literally just put my divider right in that indent and it sits in there. I'm going to set that to 1/8 of an inch, and then I'm going to go from both sides and just make 1 mark, and that's going to be my half pin. Then I'm going to take my square and my marking gauge, and because this is the tail board, we're going to go ahead, they're going to be square on the top of the board. So we're going to go ahead and just make a mark at all of your little hole locations. Just going to place my marking knife right in the hole and then slide my square up to it. And there we go. Now we have those marked out. One thing that's very helpful, especially when you're beginning, is to mark out your waist. Now we're going to cut our tails. And one thing to think about when you're dovetailing is no matter what kind of saw, even a very thin one like this Japanese dovetail saw, it's going to have tooth set on it, which means one tooth is going to be on this side and one tooth is going to be on this side, and they alternate. Why a marking knife line is so great is you can put one side or the other in your marking knife line. I consider my marking knife lines like my neighbor's fence. I can touch it, but you can't go over. So what that means is when you go to put your teeth in, you don't just put your saw in the line. You put the correct side of your saw in the line. So you can see here, just the left teeth are not in the line. If I were to put the left teeth in the line, look how big of a difference this makes. That's over another 1/64 of an inch, which a 1/64 of an inch in a dovetail is going to be a big gap. So make sure you're cutting with the right side of your teeth. So now I like to cut with my show face towards me. And I'm going to use the 8-to-1 dovetail jig here because we're doing hardwood, so that's my preferred method. So when I get my saw started, I put the correct side of the saw in the line, and I use my thumb, and I hold it sort of at an angle, and just do one backward stroke. And that just helps me kind of establish where I'm going to cut. And then I take my jig, sliding it up to it, and then I just use consistent strokes, have my arm go in the same way each time. And with my show face towards me, I can see when I get down to the line that people are going to see. And then I can check here in the back, and we're just perfect right there. So now what I'm going to do is cut every line that goes this way and then flip my board around. Okay, one thing I like to do, this is a great trick when I was first learning, and I still use this all the time, is I save the fine sawdust from when I was sawing. This makes great wood filler in case you do have a little gap. When you glue it up, you can just spread this in your joint, and it's gonna hide anything. No one will ever see it. Now, there's a few ways to clear out waste, but I like to use a coping saw. It's really easy to do this with a chisel. But I always do it, if you're gonna do it with a coping saw, do it with your show side facing you. That way you know that you're not over your line in the show side of your box. And you very simply go down and try and get as close to your line without going over. And the closer you get, the easier it's going to be when you get to your chisel portion. Just like that. Same thing over here. Also, a little tip, don't ever touch your coping saw blade after you do this. It gets hot as can be. Then we're going to flip our board over. And this is a 90-degree cut, which you can do by hand, or if you have my guide, it has a 90-degree side on it. So same thing, I just start my saw with the teeth in the right place, slide my jig up to it, and this cut goes faster because you're going across the grain, so just be careful you don't cut into your other tail. You can just snap that off. And as you can see, I left just a hair of material there just because I can pare that down with a chisel just to make sure we get a perfect match up there. I'm going to go ahead and do my other side. And this is another great benefit to the rabbit because now you know exactly where you need to start your saw. There's absolutely no guesswork to it because you know exactly where your board's going to line up. So you can just put it right against that shoulder there, slide your jig up to it. And then all we need to do is clean out the waste from our center 2 pins. So when you're chiseling out waste, what I like to do is take half and then half again until we get right up to our shoulder. One of the great things about having this rabbit is you got a 90-degree face here that is going to guide you into the right place for your chisel and make sure it's 90 degrees. If you don't have that or on the other side of your board, you can always use your jig by flipping it upside down and using it to pare down. I don't use it that often unless I'm on big, wide open pins, but what I like to do is just, and you never go all the way through. I do this from both sides. You can just keep taking half, and then when I get down to my shoulder, I put it right against the shoulder and just tap down, trying not to bruise your tails like I just did, but that's okay. This is the inside. This is, no one's ever going to see this because of this rabbit. We're going to do that on both sides here. You can use your fingers as a brake. So I have my fingers here and my hand against the board, and that's going to keep me from tapping all the way through. So just going to get right here in the shoulder. And then we're going to flip our board over and start from this side. Now this is the critical side because this is your sew side. So you don't want to just drop into that line at first because the bevel on your chisel is going to push it back into the board, thus lowering your marking gauge line. So you want to take as little as you can. Now we did a pretty good job with the coping saw here. I'm actually going to do this with a little bit bigger chisel. Just get right into my line and just tap down. And I'm going to take a little bit at a time because if you try and take that whole thing at once, it's going to push your chisel back into the middle. Now one of the things that happens to people, if you can see in here, is they get a little hump in the middle here. So it's always okay to kind of undercut this part so that you're actually down a couple degrees, and it'll create like a little concave in there, and that'll help your tails fit in. So we're going to finish up clearing up this waste here. And because you already did the back side, this one should finish it up here. So there we go. We're not going to worry about the very inside corners here. Making sure I'm not going to bruise either of my tails. If you can see in here now, there's a little bit left against the shoulder of our chisel. Now there's lots of ways to get that, but we're going to clear that out using a skew chisel, and then we're going to scoop out the middle a little bit just to ensure that we have a flat line across. And the way to check that is with your square. You can just go and make sure that it's touching down on both sides all the way across and you're not getting hung up on anything. So I'm going to put this back in my vise with my show side facing me. That way I'm certain not to mess anything up over here. And I'm just going to use my skew chisel to get those corners nice and clean. Again, skew chisel not mandatory. We're just going to scoop out the middle just a little bit. And that's looking pretty good. I'm going to use a little bit of a bigger chisel here to just make sure that we're all the way down. And again, you can scoop out in here too because no one's ever going to see the inside. So if you're getting hung up in there, you don't be afraid to scoop out the middle. And then the very last thing to do is your shoulders, which I like to do in the vise. And when you have a rabbit, you can really make sure you can see that you can use the flat of the rabbet to really make sure that you are down where you need to be there. And the most important thing when you're doing this is sharp chisels. That if you don't have sharp chisels, you might as well not do dovetails, because that's what really makes all the difference in the world. It really, really does. So we're going to go ahead and do this shoulder here. We have our tails perfect. It's time to mark them onto our pins. And the first step is we need to set our marking gauge line. So we do that by using the width of our tails. And remember, we cut a rabbet, so it's going to be different. So I just take this and press it down on my board below. And then I'm going to go ahead and just check that and make sure it's good. And again, I'm going to just adjust it just a teeny bit so that I err on the side of too much, not too little. And then we're going to go ahead and remember we marked out our board, so we're going to keep our grain match. So we're going to do it on this side here. And this one, you only need to mark off both faces because you're going to have wood here still. So you don't want to have an ugly line in your board. So we're just going to mark off the two faces. So as you can see, that line ends up being the width of the tails, not the width of the board, and that's because of that rabbet. So now let's mark them out. I'm going to show you two ways to do this. First is kind of the way that everybody does it if they don't have a dovetail alignment board and they use a hand plane. So you set your board in here at the same depth as your hand plane sits on your bench and lock that in, and then you pull your hand plane back and you put your board on top, and then people go ahead and they mark their board out. So the way a dovetail alignment board works is it goes in your vise just like this, and it's 90 degrees with two coplanar fences, and then you take your board that you're marking onto, in this case for us it's the pins, and you push it, make sure it's against your fence and the same height as the board you're marking out with, and then you just lock it into your vise. And this makes it super repeatable for you. So even if you slip, you can move your board back to your fence and get it on there again. And then you just take it, and using the flat side of your marking knife, you mark out against your tail so you have a nice clean line. And I don't put too much pressure on these because it's real easy to slip and not get it right. And there you go. You can see you have that marked out. First thing I do before I forget is mark out my waist so that I don't cut on the wrong side of the line. And you always cut in your waist. So you're always going to cut on this side, this side, this side, this side. You always want to be in your waist with your dovetail saw with those two teeth. So let's go ahead and start cleaning these up. Now I'm going to go ahead and cut my pins. I'm going to put my board in my vise here. And my dovetail jig has two pin sides on it. So what I like to do is I cut the first three going this way because I'm right-handed, and I flip the board around and cut the other three going the other way. And so what I do here is I set my, this is our waist side, so we need to be on our waist side. And one of the great things about using a jig is you can cut right up to the line. With a little practice, you won't have to chisel out the sides of your pins or your tails. So I just make sure I'm in my waist side here. I give my saw just a little bit of a head start by doing one forward stroke, and then I slide my jig right up to it. And then I get down to my side on one side, and then I get down to the side on the other side, and that creates a little hump. And a great little trick here is the end of this saw, if you tilt it up, that's a depth stop. So this won't cut, but this last tooth will. So if you have a little hump in the middle, you can just run that through the middle and just double check that everything is perfectly flat in there. And then I turn my dovetail jig around, start my saw in the waist over here, and cut out the rest of our pins. One thing to be careful about when you're chiseling here is that these are obviously at an angle. So when you're coming in from your show side, make sure that you're coming in also at an angle so you're not messing up your pins. And then when you're coming from back here, remember that they angle out the other way, so just be very careful. But I always do my show side first, establish that line, and then make sure that I don't go over from my back side. But again, this is going to be hidden in your rabbet, so you can fudge a little bit back here if you need to. So let's go ahead and start on our show side. Okay, so now we got to clean out our corners here just to make sure everything's good. You can do that with a regular chisel because tails, you got a lot more room. We're going to do it with a skew chisel just because it makes it a little bit easier. You can just clean those out. And then once we do that, we're going to check it with a square and see if we need to scoop out any of that middle. Make sure we have no bad humps in the middle. So now we're going to check it with a square here, and it looks like I'm missing a couple places on the front. So what I'm going to do, just very simply, is you can just scoop out the middle and just make sure you don't have any humps, and make sure you use your fingers as a brake so you don't go through to the other side, and just scoop out that middle. And I can see actually a couple places where it's high. You can see I missed my line on both of these, and that's good. You want to, if you're going to miss in your waist, not in your finished piece. So I'm going to hold this up here and take a look, and you can see that both of these are a little big where I missed my line. So this is actually really easy to fix. Just take your dovetail jig here, take your widest chisel, and you just put it right in that marking knife line. You want to take as little as possible here, but your dovetail jig is going to be the perfect angle. So I'm not even going to take that line right now. I'm going to just take a little teeny bite at a time. We just chop that off. And as you can see, I got right down to my line here. I'm just going to clean that up a little bit. Same thing here. And then check your fit. It's always better to go slower than faster here. Oh man, that's right about to go. What I like to do is kind of press it down, and then you can see if you have any, like right there, you can see it's kind of pushing some of that wood away. So then we know that right there is still a little thick. This is something I forgot to mention. It's also useful, is just some files. And you want files that don't cut on the edges. Like this one cuts on one edge but not the other. So that's the edge I put down towards my board. And I'm just going to give it just a little rub here. We're so close that I don't want to try and cut it with a chisel because I know I'm going to go over. So I just give it a little rub, both sides. You're really just even smoothing out the saw marks. Okay, now we're going to go ahead, trying our fit again. I can already tell that's fitting way better. I can feel this is proud a little bit over here, which means we still need to just, this one's good, but this one over here is a little proud. And so I'm going to look at two things here. One, I'm going to look at whether the pin itself is square, and it looks like I might have got a little wonky on that. So I'm going to just take my square here, and look, if you look real close, you can see that I got a pretty large slant to that one. So what we're going to do to bring that in square again, we're going to take our tailboard and stick it in our vise so that it's perfectly level with our pin board. Just like that. I'm going to lock my vise in, and then we're going to use our jig as a chisel guide again. And we're not going to cut the top, we're just going to cut the bottom and square that back up. A little bit more. We're real close now, so I don't want to risk it with the chisel. There we go. Starting to look good there. Let's check this again here. Whew, and there we go. Those are some really good fitting dovetails here. Okay, now we're just going to put glue, and the great thing about dovetails is you just need a little teeny bit. And we're actually going to put some on the outside and use that sawdust trick I was telling you about. So I'm really not going to use that much at all right now. Now the sawdust trick that I was telling you about is great. All you do here is you just take glue, rub it into every joint, then use a wet towel just to wipe it off, and then you just take your sawdust that you saved from sawing and you just rub that into the glue. And then when you go to sand it, you just give it a light sanding. All right, I'm gonna let that dry for about 30 minutes. We'll give it a quick cleanup, a little sanding, and then put some lacquer on it, and we'll finish this guy up. That came out really good. One of the raging debates about dovetails is whether to leave your marking gauge lines. Some people say that they look hand cut. Some people say that they don't like the look, but I left them in so you could see what it looks like with the marking gauge lines. Typically I take them out, but I wasn't about to sit here and sand for 10 minutes on a sample piece. These came out really good. I can only see one teeny little gap right here, and it's just about a hair length long, and it's just because I missed that area with glue. Use that glue trick. I've been using that since my first set of dovetails, and it makes you look like a genius even if you're not. So hopefully this gives you the confidence to go try the holiday dovetail challenge. Head over to my Instagram. There's a link below. $400 prize pack, including this Lee Nielsen rabbiting block plane you saw me use in the video, the Stanley chisels you saw me use, the dovetail saw you saw me use, the jigs you saw me use. And head over to my website, grab yourself a dovetail alignment board. It's really, really helpful. Guys, thanks for watching. Stay safe in the shop and have a wonderful day. On this week's Joint of the Week, we're going to do the very decorative and very cool Houndstooth Dovetail. This is a joint that's used in decorative boxes as well as workbenches. It connects with the chop, it connects your side panel with the chop, and it's a decorative way to do what is traditionally a dovetail. It's a pretty easy joint. It's kind of a combination of a couple things, but if you can cut a dovetail, you can do this. We're going to do it in a half blind fashion. You don't have to. You could do it as a full through dovetail as well. So let's get started. First things first, I'm going to make sure I have super square ends. When you're doing dovetails this big, squareness is a good thing to really keep track of. I have an issue I need to discuss with my table saw, which is he is off by about 1 degree, which seems like a bigger problem than just adjusting the table. That hasn't happened before. So I'm going to use my shooting board and just square this thing up and make sure we're good. And I'm just going to check regularly. So there we go. Okay, so the first thing you want to do on a Houndstooth dovetail is layout. Now, we're going to do ours as a half blind, as if we were doing the chop at the end of a workbench. In fact, I cut these pieces sort of to resemble a workbench. They're 3 inches tall. The chop is about 2 inches. You would do that out of 8/4 material. And so I'm going to have my half blind come to 1/4 inch, and I'm just going to use my combo square to get that measurement. I know I've mentioned it 100 times, but it's just the most useful tip. Your combo square should have indents where the measurements are laser etched in there. So I just use it to put the wheel of my marking gauge in. And the outside of my board, which I have labeled, is going to be facing you, the viewer, right now. So I'm just going to mark that 1/4 inch in there. And then what's cool about that is I can take the measurement for my tailboard, and you kind of want to do them in this order that I'm doing it, because it just helps you, especially if you only have one marking gauge. But I can just put it right in that line, snug it up to my board here, and then go and mark my tailboard at the same time, doing it lightly first and then a little bit stronger. You just want to make sure those lines meet up all the way around there. So we want 2 tails, and we want to think about layout. And so we know we want our pins to be sort of narrow. So the way that I like to lay out, especially when I'm doing even number tails, is I like to take off 1/4 inch from both sides and then take the measurement in between them. So that's 2.5 inches. I'm going to split that in half, which was 1 1/4. And this is just rough layout. I'm not going to use this for actually cutting. This is just to help me when I mark out on my tailboard how I'm going to do it. So we know that we're going to have our measurements there, and then we can split those in half, and that's where our little Houndstooth dovetails are going to go. So there's a good indication. So when we're laying out our tailboard, we can make sure we get those measurements right. Okay, now we want to measure how far down we want our Houndstooth to go. And this is where it can get a little bit tricky. I like to go down 2/3 because I feel that's aesthetically pleasing, but your marking gauge is gonna have to change by the distance, this 1/4 inch that we already measured. So you want to not make this arbitrary. You wanna do it something that is measurable and repeatable so that you can adjust your marking gauge accordingly. And so what I like to do is I find a measurement that's about 2/3 on my ruler and set it to that. And that way I know I can take a 1/4 inch off of it. So I'm doing 1 3/8. And then that way I can easily take a 1/4 off that. So I'm just gonna mark out, and only right below where my marks are for my houndstooth, just gonna make a little mark like that. And then I'm gonna readjust my marking gauge. And you're gonna wanna verify these measurements after you cut your tails, but you should be right on. So we're gonna go ahead and readjust our marking gauge. And then we can go ahead and transfer that to our tails board. And again, do these kind of light because you don't want to have to sand out too much later. Okay, perfect. So now we have our depths laid out. Now it's time to lay out our tails. Okay, now we've already laid out on our pin board where we're going to put them. So I'm just going to basically this is just a rough transfer. I'm going to do it lightly in pencil. Let me get my ruler, make sure everything's right. And then on these little houndstooth, I'm just gonna go a 32nd on either side and keep them really thin. And that is gonna give us those nice thin pins we're after. So one thing you might wanna do that'll help you if you're not using a Katz-Moses magnetic dovetail jig is just draw these lines out with like a dovetail marker. I, of course, am gonna be using the Katz-Moses jig, so I don't really need to. But it will help you sort of remember where everything goes. Okay, we're gonna go ahead and cut these. Remember, don't go past your lines on your little houndstooth there. That's a common mistake that I made when I was first learning these, is I would forget and go past my line. I'm gonna breeze through these. I have a great video called A Comprehensive Guide to Cutting Dovetails. It has every tip and trick I've ever learned about cutting dovetails, but we're gonna breeze through these and get this waste cleared out, and then we'll check back in when it's time to clear out some waste on our half blind side. Okay, now we are going to mark out our tails onto our pin board. And this is where you want to verify those depth gauges that you made before. A great little trick for making sure that your board is up against your depth line is you could take a chisel, set it right in your marking gauge line, and you can just pull your board to it. And then once your chisel is touching the top and the bottom, you know you're right on that marking gauge line. Then you want to look through and verify that your marking gauge lines you did for your houndstooth tails are there. And then using, depending on how skinny you made your tails, you want to use a skinny marking knife. Then you want to just mark out your tails. And you also want to verify that your marking gauge line from before is right on as well. What's great about these dovetail alignment boards too, you can see I had a little movement there, but it's really easy just to go reference right back against the fence. I have CNC versions of these on my website. Now here's where you want to mark out the depth on your pin board. So you can just take your marking gauge, and that's where you're going to set up this line here. And this is going to be your depth line. And if you want to see where you're going to be going to, you can take your marking gauge and continue down the tail line that you marked out. Now we're going to go ahead and start cutting out our waist. And if you're going to use your jig, I highly recommend that you put some tape, or this is UHMW, UHMV, I can't remember, tape. And it's just the same thing those white cutting boards are made out of. It's a super slick surface, and it just helps because of the tooth set on your saw will scratch the face of your jig if you don't protect it. Otherwise, you can cut these by hand because there's not a lot of sawing you can do. We're going to start clearing out our waist. I'm going to stay a little bit away from our line because what's great about half blind is the only thing that matters is this face and maybe the first very little bit, maybe the first 32nd of an inch. So I'm going to get pretty close to my line, then I'll use a chisel, and I'm going to sort of undercut them by about 1 or 2 degrees just so that it's easy for this to slide in, especially once we get glue there. So I'm going to stay a little bit away from my line. You want to make sure you don't go past this line and the baseline you set behind you here. We're going to use the jig, and then from there we'll just start taking out waste one way or another. I'll give you some ideas here in a minute. Okay, so now we have to figure out how to get this waste out of here. And you want to be really careful and make sure you identify what your waste is. I do it with pencil, you could do it with marker, but basically you're keeping that, that, and that. The rest is garbage. And so there's a lot of ways to do this. I've seen Matt Cremona, which is a really cool idea, use a drill press to get some of this waste out. You could use a chisel, you could probably use a router. There's a lot of ways to do it, but I'm just gonna do it the old-fashioned way with chisels here because that's not gonna take too long. Especially what you have to remember is keep your marking knife lines till the end. Get everything out of there. And then last thing you should do is take those marking knife lines. So don't work to those yet. Just try and get a bulk of the waste out. And this is a good time to maybe use your second set of chisels. Make sure your nice chisels are sharp. This is a Matt Esliya trick. Make sure your nice chisels are sharp. Use your dull, your not as good ones. Wow, it was really hard not to swear there. Get out a bulk of the waste and then use your nice ones to get down the line. Save you some sharpening, I guess. So let's get to chopping. Okay, so I've got the first kind of side of one of the bigger tails cleaned out, and I think I'm gonna call an audible and go over to the drill press and try and clear out some of this waste. It is really hard with these houndstooth to get in some of these corners. So to make it easier on myself, I'd love to be able to clear out some of that with the drill press, and then it's really easy to chisel down to your lines because it's end grain. I did have one little slip up here in the corner where I took away too much, but you know what, we'll figure out a way to hide that with a little piece of walnut or something. But all in all, it's coming along really well. It's just when you get into that opposite corner that's at the tip of the houndstooth, it is really hard to get in there. I kind of did a series of chopping down and then kind of scooping motion with my chisel to sort of get into the corners and make sure everything was cleared out. When you do think you have everything cleared out, take a square, stick it in there, and just, verify both visually and by feeling with your square that it's not hanging up on anything, that you have cleaned it down to the level which you need. So we're gonna go ahead and set up at the drill press and use a small Forstner bit to sort of clear out some of this waste. Okay, so we've got all this cleaned up and we're ready to glue this up and see what it looks like. One of the things that I learned while I was doing this, those back corners are really hard to get into. So that drill press was really, really helpful. I would definitely do it that way next time. And also, just when you're trying to get in the corners, you got to use all the tools that are available to you. Whatever you got, you're going to find interesting ways to get into those corners, whether it's a skew chisel or a really small chisel, that kind of thing. But I would work your way into the corners, going from the side to the back to the side to the back. Don't just try and get it all at once. You're going to get a big divot in there. All right, so we're going to go ahead and glue this up. I've had this experience before, and just a little warning, put a clamp around your piece. These walls can get really thin, and it just sort of helps things from splitting apart if you're worried about it at all. All right, let's get this put together and see what she looks like. Wow, guys, that really came out so good. I'm really happy with this one, and I feel like I learned so much. And that's what Joint of the Week really is about. It's about pushing myself and practicing things that I haven't done before and learning. And so here's what I learned. One is the first third, when you're coming in, cutting, when you're clearing out waste for your pins, make sure that's really flat. That's gonna help you reference for the back, because the back's really tough to get into. You gotta use all the tools available to you to really clear out that waste. Use the drill press to clear out waste. And that's something I've seen Matt Cremona do on half-blind dovetails. It really works. It works great, and it really helps. The more waste you get out of there, the easier chiseling is. The other thing that is always true when you are chiseling into end grain, as you would on the pins of any set of dovetails, but especially when you're doing something that's half-blind, especially when you're doing something that's this big, is end grain chisels really fast. So don't get to that line until you're ready. And when you do, make sure your chisel's right in it and make sure you're at 90. And then with any half blind, you can undercut. Everything below the surface doesn't really matter because it's never going to be seen. So make it easy on yourself, undercut it by a couple degrees, and it's going to be really easy to seat your piece and make sure you fit it in there when you hammer it home. So this is a joint, and honestly, I've heard it called a lot of names. Castle joint, Korean fist tenon, Japanese locking mortise and tenon joint. But this is a joint that Sam Maloof used in a lot of his furniture. It's been used for thousands of years in Korean timber framing, in Japanese furniture. And the reason is it's just so incredibly strong. It's pretty easy to do. Layout is absolutely key, and just taking your time and fitting things together. But all in all, this took me about an hour to cut with filming. So it's really not that difficult of a joint. Let me show you how we get it done. So our first step in making this joint is preparing the stock. Now it's really important that all of your pieces are square and the same. So what we're gonna do, we're gonna joint plane these and get them down to, I'm gonna aim for 2 inches by 2 inches. We might be a little bit under. One thing I suggest is that your number is easily divisible by 3. Just make your life a little bit easier. A lot of this is gonna be measuring third, third, third. So we're gonna head on over to the jointer and get started. So now that our stock is prepared, everything's square, it's all the same size, we need to do our layout. Now, you could go about this several different ways, but let me show you my plan of attack on this. For me, I think the way I'm going to attack this is I'm going to start by cutting my main piece and then my mating pieces second. That way I can get these to fit to this. The least important part is the half lap between these two joints. That can be kind of loose because when this comes in and locks in, it's going to lock everything together. So ensuring that all of these cuts are square and precise, this joint is going to come out square and really, really strong. So I'm going to start by cutting these out here on the table saw. Let me show you how I go about doing that. The layout is ultra important. So this is 2 inches. We need essentially a third of 2 inches, a third of 2 inches. We have to make sure that we stay on the right sides of our lines here. So we're going to go ahead and set up a little system here with the crosscut sled to do that and making sure everything's square. So here we go. Okay, so on these, you're going to know whether you're right on the money if these are essentially perfect squares. You can have a little teeny bit of play, but you want to just verify that everything's all good to go. Okay, now that we've got our lines cut for our tenons, we're going to have to clear out this waste. And I'm going to do this with a coping saw, a chisel, and a mallet. I feel like I'm going to get a lot cleaner that way, but you could easily do it with a table saw and a flat bottom blade. I just feel like to set it up and make sure it was square every single time would be tough. Unless you were using a tenoning jig that slides along the fence of your table saw, that would be great too. This is the way I'm going to choose to do it, but it's not the only way to do it. So let me show you how I clear this out and clean it up. Okay, so now that we've cleaned up and cut out all the pieces for our leg piece, it's time to lay out the the half laps and the mating pieces here. Now you want to make sure you orient your grain the way you want it to be and place it where you want it in that section of the mating piece. But all I'm going to do is place it up against, very carefully hold it in place, and take my marking knife and simply just mark up both sides. And then using my square, I'm going to carry those lines around the piece. So I have faint lines right here. And just like in the essential skills for accuracy in woodworking video I did, I'm going to slide my marking knife into that line, slide my square up to it, and just simply deepen it up. Now we know that because we want these pieces to fit, that when we cut these, we're going to need to take those lines to the very edge of the line to make sure that piece has a little bit of wiggle room to fit. So you kind of want to go over that line by, I don't know, a very, very small, minuscule amount. Just for posterity's sake, we'll check that, make sure it's all good. And it is. So now we need to set our depth. A good reason to have 2 marking gauges in the shop. We haven't changed our depth here. So I'm going to mark a 1/3 in here. Flip it around. Do the other side here. Just checking it, making sure that that's going to work. And it is. So then we can now continue our lines with our marking knife to that gauge line. So you can see that's going to be where all of this is going to be removed. And we're going to do that for both pieces of maple. Now that we have most of our mortises cut, we're going to start cleaning them up. Use your saw marks as a great gauge for cleaning it up with a chisel or a rabbiting block plane or a shoulder plane, and make sure you're testing as you go. So you want to make sure you know that glue is going to cause things to tighten up. So you want it to be sort of loose but not too loose. I mean, you want like just a hair's width worth of play in your joint. So you want to be checking this measurement here and making sure that's right, and then this measurement here. So right now mine doesn't fit yet. If it fits into here, but it doesn't fit crossways yet, so we need to clean that up. I'm going to use my saw blade marks as my gauge. You can see here I've already cleaned off my saw blade marks, just barely gone like right to them. So that's when I'm going to start checking, because I know with my layout lines, I'm not even quite to it on this one yet, that's exactly where I need to be. So when I start getting really close, I'll know because my saw blade marks are gone. So I'm going to start working on those. Okay, so I can't stress this enough. This is the part of this joint where you really need to focus on all the details here. So what I like to do when I start to get it to fit, I start to feel whether each of the posts is proud or low of the surface. So here I can see that my B, the walnut, is a little low compared to the maple, whereas on my A side, it's dead even. But then if I go over here, I can feel that the walnut's proud here and low here, so I know that I need to take a little bit off this corner and off of this corner, and that's going to allow it to sit flush. So ideally, you want it to slide on without having to hit it with a hammer, but it should still be hard to push on, and all of these should be flush all the way around, and that's how you can really adjust and make sure this joint fits perfect. Because this is the critical part, and if you do this and take the time to get this right, you're going to be really, really happy when you put together your piece of furniture. Okay, so now that we have our pieces fit up, our mortises cut, it's time to do the half lap in between them. And so when you do this, make sure you give yourself some leeway. This is the point where 3 separate pieces are coming together that are maybe 1/128 off a little bit. So give yourself some room, because this joint is going to get locked in by these 4 posts. It doesn't need to be super tight. It just needs to accommodate the other one. And once you get glue in there, this thing won't go anywhere for 1,000 years. So What I'm going to do now is I'm going to put in each one of my pieces, and I'm going to use my marking knife. I'm going to mark out the whole thing, just so I know. And I'm ensuring that I've marked all my pieces which way is up here. And I'm going to mark out each side. And then when I go to cut these out and do the half flaps, I'm going to ensure that I kind of take a lot of that line and make sure. So I'm going to put my other piece in there, mark that out, and then I'll do a little bit of layout and cut our half flaps for this. So now we're going to do our final fit up before glue up, and when we finesse these joints in, one of the things you want to do here is chamfer the corners that you're never going to see, and that's going to really help things go together. Our inside joint here is plenty loose enough, but I just want to make sure that there's nothing that's going to snag up here when I get glue in the final joint. So I'm just going to chamfer all these corners where everything goes together. Everything that's going to be hidden, I'm going to take down the corners just like this, being careful not to chop your fingers off. And then we'll do that on our other piece here. One of the things when I just tried to test fit it together where I got a snag was just from this tear out here was binding everything up. So just make sure that you get everything put together. And let's head over to the bench and do a final fit up and glue this thing together. So I've gone ahead and thrown some lacquer on this, and man, did this come out really, really good. You know, I can find the mistakes, but really I don't think anybody really would be able to see them. It's beautiful. It was easy to put together. You can use this so many different ways, in cantilevered tables, in chair furniture, in timber framing. But this is a really cool joint that you should put in the old wallet, you know, bring out when you need it, because it's strong as can be. This will never break. I bet you could put 1,000 pounds on this sample piece, much less a table or chair you made. On this week's Joint of the Week, we're going to do one of the most popular joints in woodworking, the wedged mortise and tenon. This is a gorgeous joint used in furnitures, attaching legs to stretchers. It's used in workbenches, all over the place. And it may look easy, but to be honest, this is my second time doing it. I'm going to show you that quickly because it is terrible. So this is just a good reminder for me personally to, you know, remember that good woodworking takes good practice, and that's what Joint of the Week's all about. So let's fix our mistakes and lay out a mortise. So I'm going to assume you have square milled stock. We're starting from that point. I'm going to be attaching a piece of walnut to a piece of walnut with some maple wedges. So we're going to put the maple aside for now. Now, when laying out a mortise, you need to consider a few things. One, for me, what I like to think about is what is going to make my life easier. Usually when you have to do mortise and tenon, you got quite a few of them to do. And so what I like to do is do them about the size of my router bit. We're going to be using a 1/2 inch router bit, actually a really cool router bit, I'll show you in a minute. And this piece is 1 inch. And so what I'm going to do is find the center of this board and lay it out at 1/2 inch, ensuring that one, my router bit will cut it in one pass, not depth obviously, but one lengthwise pass, and that way I'm taking off a very easily calculable amount from this piece, which is 1/4 inch from each side. So to lay these out, what I like to do obviously first is find the middle. You could do that a lot of ways, exactly 3 inches, so our middle is 1.5 inches. Whenever I'm laying out mortises, I start with a pencil, and then when I know that it's where I want it to be, I'll move to a marking knife, and that marking knife line is going to help you later when you're chiseling and also help you with your route. I'm gonna be using this really cool ultimate router jig that I built. It does all sorts of things. I'll link the video right here in the corner, really cool. But all you really need is an edge guide for this. You just would need to place this and find the center. I'm also gonna be using this really cool 1/2-inch bit from a company called BitsBits. There's a discount code down below, great company, and they put this really cool coating on router bits so they last forever. They're awesome stuff. But the reason I like to use an upcut bit, one, because you need to clear chips on a mortise, otherwise everything's gonna get real hot in there and you could ruin the life of your bit or burn your wood. But also a spiral bit as opposed to a straight bit is a lot better at cleaner cuts and removing material. So we're gonna go ahead and set this up and then we'll head over to the table saw and cut our tenons. Our mortise is done. One thing I didn't mention is when you're cutting it, you should label your inside and outside and make sure you get a really nice crisp line on the outside, and then you're gonna fit your tenon backwards. You're gonna test it from the outside because that's obviously where you want it to look the best. And then the inside, you know, I have a little bit of blowout here. Not a big deal because you're gonna have a lip all the way around your tenon that hides any imperfections. So for laying out our tenon, because this is a through mortise and tenon with wedges, I'm going to try and make it proud. Doesn't always happen. I might flush trim it, but it would be cool if we can keep about a 1/4 inch on it. So what I'm gonna do is set my distance with my stop block, and I'm just gonna take my stop block and slide my piece in between here, just like that, and then I'm going to take it out a 1/4 inch. So I'm gonna just slide the micro adjust over here, a 1/4 inch. And that's gonna make me proud. So now that I have my tenon shoulder laid out, probably best practice to lay that out with a marking knife on your piece. Now for actually cutting your tenon, it's the reason we leave a little bit extra is we can use that as a test. Make sure you're using a flat bottom blade or a dado stack. Because I don't have a lot of material to roof here, I'm just gonna use my regular blade. But if you had a big tenon, it'd be easier to use a dado stack. I know you Europeans don't have those. So I'm gonna measure from the outside of the board. You basically wanna take the height of your mortise and subtract it from the height of your board and then divide that by 2, and that's gonna be the height of your blade. So we're gonna go ahead and do some test passes and then do some final passes. You want it to be pretty darn snug because whether you use a dado stack or a regular 10-inch blade, you're gonna have some marks on there that you're gonna wanna clean up with some hand plane, so you're gonna take off another very, very, very teeny amount. So if it's really snug now, when you clean up the tenon, it's gonna fit perfectly. So now we need to drill our relief holes, which will keep this from splitting all the way down, and our kerfs. You can easily cut this with a handsaw, but I find that the size of the wedge that comes with a handsaw kerf is just super thin, and if anything sort of binds up, you're gonna snap them off and end up, you know, having a very thin line for your wedge, which I think it doesn't look as cool as maybe a little bit thicker one, and also you risk breaking it off. So I'm actually gonna cut this kerf with my table saw, and then we're gonna drill holes here. And easy way to place holes equally when you're doing an odd number is divide by 1 more than you're trying to do. So I need 2 holes, so I'm gonna take this length, 1 1/4, and divide it by 3, which is 0.41 2/3 roughly, which is roughly 13 seconds. Don't worry, I'm not that fast at math. I looked this up before we started recording. Okay, so now that we have our kerfs cut, it is time to cut our wedges. And here's a great little trick I learned about how to cut consistent, slow tapering wedges. You really want these wedges to be super consistent. Otherwise, you're gonna have something that looks geometrically just sort of off. So what I do is I take something that's about right around double the thickness of the wedge that I want. So we're shooting for an 1/8 inch length. That's what's going to spread that out. And you're gonna take that piece that's about double the thickness of the wedge that you want and double stick tape that to the edge of your board. And you want it to sit above the surface of your board because you don't want it to get out of square this way. So that's gonna ride along your fence. Then you're gonna take your sawtooth and start it right at the edge of your board. And you want to make sure it's right at the edge because you're going to need to reference the edge later again. So this is going to help you be consistent. So you can see that's just right. That tooth is exactly even with that edge. Then I'm going to run it through. And when I'm done, I'm going to flip it around so that the part that I cut the wedge from is flat against the fence. And then I'm going to align the edge of the board again with that final tooth. I'll bump my fence over. And that's going to give me 2 perfectly consistent wedges. So let me show you how I do it. Now we're just about ready to glue this up. First we need to clean up our tenon, just get rid of these saw marks. Now that we have our wedges cut and sized, that's one thing I forgot to mention over at the table saw. It's probably easier to do that wedge thing if you cut it to the right width of your tenon first. So I just go in sideways, and you want to do them at the same time. So I just go until you get like a friction fit. And then you want to tap them at the same time, because again, you really want that even line in the middle. So you got to remember, glue is going to get in there and make things start to swell. So you want to mark them about right where they bottom out here. And then once you figure that out, then you can just cut them, you know, about halfway down your tenon, because there's no way once glue gets in there, you're going to get these things all the way down. Glue just sort of binds everything up no matter what you do. So I'm going to go ahead and mark these, making sure that my wedges are even up here. For measuring the length of our wedge, you want to go roughly, and this is rough because you're going to hit these in with a hammer, but maybe like 2/3 of the way down. Just going to mark mine right above the hole. And trust me, this seems like, oh, it's just a wedge, but this makes all the difference in the world of the look. So I'm going to go ahead and cut them off here. This is, again, the bottom. And then I'm not going to cut right at my height line. I'm going to cut above that. 1, because it's going to give us a thicker thing to hit with a hammer. 2, it is going to make them less likely to break when you're putting it in because you get a little bit more material, and you're going to flush trim it off later. So I'm going to cut above, not too far above, because you want to make sure that they go in equally, and the bigger they are, the easier it is to mess that up. So now we have our wedges. Make sure you label them which way is up, because otherwise you're gonna forget and put one in backwards and mess up your whole joint. Now let's glue it up. Wow, guys, that came out really cool. I love the way that looks, and it is so imperative when you do that you take your time with the wedges, because you really want them to be equal and the same width and all that stuff. So use those tricks I showed you for getting equal size wedges, and just take your time when you're cutting the outside face of your mortise, because that's obviously what's going to show. So let me know what you'd like to see on the next joint of the week. I love doing this series, and I love learning. Again, this was my second try. Had a big fail the first time, and I'm so happy we nailed it this time. In my most recent video, the Infinity Cube table, I used bridle joints, 18 continuous bridle joints. And bridle joints are amazing because they go together perfectly square. They're ultra strong, and they're pretty easy to cut. Because I had to do so many, I figured out a really cool jig that allows you to cut both the tongue and groove on either your table saw or your router table without changing the setup. So I'm going to walk you through how I made that jig. All you need is some MDF, some screws, and you'll use clamps when you're cutting. I found this toggle clamp was really easy because I was doing so many, but it's not necessary. So let's get into cutting up some MDF and putting this thing together. All right, so I have my old jig here, and I'm showing you our pieces here. So this large piece, that's gonna ride against the fence, and that distance is unimportant. So if you're using 3/4 inch plywood, no big deal, because we're gonna set everything up. These next three pieces are our support pieces. They are what sits behind the piece of wood and keeps it square, straight up and down. So this is gonna need to be attached very square. So what I'm going to do is attach these three pieces together with screws, making sure to stay away from the edges, because then we're going to trim this up to make sure it's very square. Then what I do is I set it down like this. I will put my piece in here so that the support sort of lines up on this edge. Doesn't really matter, but this is going to ensure that it's square to my table. I'm going to clamp it, and then I'm going to screw them together. You want to make sure all your screws are countersunks or driven below the surface, so that way they don't affect any of the cutting when you get to it. But we're going to go ahead and put this together. Now, these are two shims that I cut. One is just extra in case I screw one up. We'll get into these here in a minute. But let's go ahead and start putting this together. Okay, so we've got this thing put together. We're gonna end up clamping our piece in here. So let's talk about setup. I'm gonna show you first on the table saw and then on the router table. So depending on the size of your piece, I'm using 1.5 inches because that is very easy to use as an instructional aid. But you need to put this face 1/3 of the width of your piece away from the blade. So that's gonna be 1/2 inch for me. 1.5 divided by 3, 1/2 inch. So that's gonna be 1/2 inch. And then your shim also needs to be that same measurement. So your shim needs to be 1/2 inch in my case. And then what we're gonna do, we're gonna actually add some stickers to this like I did here. These are J-Bait stickers. They're nice and thick, so they actually worked really well. And the reason is because you don't want your piece to go together so tight that once you get glue in there, it's gonna be really hard to get together. You want just a slight amount of play. So that's why we're gonna add some stickers to the shim. You then make your cut. So you're gonna clamp your piece in, and this is how you're gonna cut your groove. You're gonna clamp your piece in and run it through, and then I always flip it around to make sure it's dead center. Run it through, and then you're gonna add your shim like this. You're gonna clamp that in, run it through, flip your piece around and run it through, and you should have a perfect joint. So I'm gonna go ahead and add 1 row of stickers to my shim, see how that works. If I need to, I'll add another sticker to it, or you can use like a piece of paper or something nice and thin. But once you have it all dialed in, you can do 100 joints all at the same time without ever changing your table saw. Okay, so as you can see, this didn't quite go together, which is okay. This cut is not affected by the shim, so we would add stickers or take away stickers depending on what we want to do this. We're going to take away stickers if we want to thin it out, because then this piece is going to sit over further into the blade. And so that's what we're going to do. We're actually going to remove the stickers. We may not have needed those in the first place. So we'll run this same piece and see if it fits. One thing to be mindful of is you need to make sure the entire piece goes past the center of the blade. As you can see right here, I stopped a little early because I was using that feather board. I actually took that away so that way I could pull backwards on the thing. But if you wanted to, you could go all the way through the blade, all the way past. That's another way to do it. So let's remove those stickers and give this one more cut. All right, let's see what we have. That should have done the trick there. Look at that. That is just about perfect. Perfect 90, got a good, nice fit there. And they are tight enough that it's gonna create a nice clean joint, but also loose enough that you'll be able to get glue and clamp it up, no problem. If you needed to adjust it further, let's say the center tongue piece was still too wide, instead of trying to adjust your fence and get it to work, what you could do is thin out your shim. So take like a hand planer or a card scraper and thin it out a little bit, or run it lightly through your planer, and you'd be able to dial in that fit. But the trick is, once you get your fence set and you cut your center groove, you do not want to mess with it. So you want to mess with your shim only, and you'll get that perfect fit that you want dialed in. Let's head over to the router table. I'll show you how I do it over there. Okay, same thing over here. We're gonna be using this same compression bit that I got from Bits. There's a discount code down below. In fact, they're letting you use it twice in the first quarter this year, which is pretty cool of them. We're gonna set the bit to the height of our material. Now, typically I preach with router bits to remove some material before you do a bunch. This bit is so incredible. It removes material pretty efficiently, so I'm gonna go ahead and run it, but you may wanna remove some material on the table saw before you start just taking full passes with this. But there we go, perfect depth. And then the setup's gonna be the same as on the table saw. You are going to set this so that it is exactly ½ inch away from your bit. You can do that with a scrap of your MDF. With a router table, it's a lot easier than the table saw. Okay, so we're dialed in there, and then we're gonna go ahead and run our pieces the same way we did before. You always wanna cut your groove first, which is where you're cutting out the centerpiece, and you're gonna run that both ways so you make sure you're dead center, and then you're gonna adjust with your shim. Okay, just so you know I'm not cheating, those are the ones from the table saw. I wrote TS on them. Here's this one. This is the first try right off the router. That is a pretty good fit. It's a little tight. Actually, it's about good. That's about as tight as you would want it to be, which is, you know, just a little bit of friction. But the greatest thing about bridle joints is that's just perfectly square all the way around. I mean, that's just great. That's such a cool joint, and it's so strong, it's beautiful, it's great to use. And this jig is really just so simple, and the best part is you don't have to change your setup, which is the hardest part about cutting two sides of joinery. So, guys, thanks for watching. If you want to support the channel, head over to the Katz-Moses store, pick up a stop block, a dovetail jig, a t-shirt, coffee cup. We got lots of great stuff over there. Sorry, I'll quit listing things. On this week's Joint of the Week, we're gonna do the half-blind dovetail. This is a great fundamental joint that's used in a lot of drawer construction or anytime you don't want end grain visible on the front of a joint. It is a beautiful joint, and it's actually really easy to do. If you can cut a through dovetail, you can certainly cut a half-blind dovetail. We're gonna start with just the half-blind dovetail this week, and then we're gonna work our way up to inlaid half-blind dovetails next week. So, let's head over to the table saw, and I'm going to show you how you get this joint started, and then we'll come back to the bench and lay it out. The way a half-blind dovetail joint works is you're going to cut tails into the sideboard. For example, if this was a drawer, the reason you would do it that way is because you would pull out on that drawer, so you want your tails in your sideboard because that's where the most pressure over time is going to be. But you don't go all the way through, so you need to decide how far up you want to go. And you can see these boards are different thicknesses because our drawer face is typically going to be a lot thicker board than the side material of our drawers. So you're going to have to readjust your marking gauge or have two of them, but you need to decide how far up you're going to go. So this board is about 3/4 of an inch, and if I was going to split it into 2/3, I would do 0.5. And I look at this and I go, yeah, that would be pretty cool, but let's go a little bit further. I think it'll make it look a little bit slicker and cooler from the side. So we're gonna go to 0.6. And so that is going to be how far you're going to set your marking depth on your tails board. So I've got my marking gauge set to that, and we're going to make our tails here, our tails depth line. And that is also going to be the distance from the inside of your drawer face or your mating board that you're going to cut your tails to. So that's a good thing to mark out right now. But there's also another way to do this, which I'll show you at the bench. I'm just going to do it now. And then you're going to adjust your marking gauge to the depth of your tails, which is going to be the thickness of your sideboard. So then it's always good to label outside and inside when you're doing these. Say outside, inside, that's going to help you keep track of where you're going here. So this is our inside, so this is the depth that we're going to cut down to on our pin side. And now one thing that I like to do, and it's not mandatory, is to cut a rabbet into this board. Because on a half-blind dovetail, the only part that is ever going to be visible of your whole dovetail situation is going to be right here on this face. So if you were to, let's say, have some tear out on the inside of your tails board, that would show. But if you cut a little rabbet, not only does it help you with squareness, it helps you hide any mistakes. And as we all know, we are not perfect woodworkers. We make mistakes. And finding ways to hide them is awesome. So I'm going to cut a very small rabbet into this board. So let's call it a 1/16, and I'm just going to use my calipers here to mark that out. And this is just going to help me set my saw blade. And then this, you should probably use a flat bottom blade. This isn't a flat bottom blade, but I will use it as a chance to use my rabbeting hand plane, block plane, which I always love an excuse to use. So I'm going to go ahead and set my saw blade here. We're going to use that line we just drew to set the depth. So we've got our depth set, and we're going to go ahead and set the distance we're going to cut into our board here. And we're going to do that, and I have a great video called Superior Accuracy in Woodworking or something like that that talks about this technique here, but we're going to take the tip of the tooth and we're going to just put it right on the line we want to cut to. There we go, and then we're going to put the Katz-Moses no deflection stop block, which if you have pre-ordered that, they should be shipping in a few weeks. I should be getting samples here in a couple weeks of the finished product, which means they will have extruded everything and they're just waiting for final approval on machining. So there's a little update for you. So there we go. So we're perfectly against there, and we're going to make a few passes and cut our rabbet. I'm going to start with my inside pass closest to my line and go real slow and carefully, and then after that you can just sort of go nuts because you know you're not going to go over your line. So let's do this, and then we'll head back over to the bench and talk about layout. So we're going to go ahead and just clean up this rabbet really quickly. Which, if you just watched my which hand planes to buy video, you'll know how much I love using this guy. So let's set the nicker here and use that to make sure we don't get any tear out here at the end. Perfect. So we're just going to check that rabbet for square. Oh, look at that. Right on the money. And then again across. Right on the money again. Okay, now let's talk about layout. For layout, as always, I believe that thinner pins look gorgeous. Same thing for half blind. We're going to make these very thin pins, and the way I'm going to do that is I'm going to take a set of dividers or compass, whatever you want to call it, and I'm going to go 1/8 inch in from each side, just like that. And then I'm going to take them, and I always say this, but it's a good reminder, a good ruler is going to have indents, so you can easily find the locations for your marking gauge or your dividers by just putting it in the indent and sliding till you feel it click. Boom, there we go. We're going to go to 5/8. We're going to start in that little dot we just made 1/8 inch away, and we're going to walk our dividers across. Now, people always ask me, like, how do you decide? Well, to be honest, we go a little bit of trial and error. Usually I'll do it on a cutoff from the same board so it's the same width and kind of play with it until I find something that looks good. There's no real kind of math to deciding this, but there we go. Those will be where our tails are. Go ahead and mark those out. And again, in that video I linked in the corner earlier, for superior accuracy, this technique is talked about also in my comprehensive guide to cutting dovetails. I'd highly recommend you watch that if you're new to dovetails. It just has every trick that I know and have learned over the years. I just wanted to compile them into one video so we don't keep putting them out all over the place. So we're just gonna mark those out. And there we go. And now we're gonna grab our 8-to-1 Katz-Moses magnetic dovetail jig and cut these out. Now again, like I said, watch that comprehensive guide to cutting dovetails, and we're gonna breeze right through this because we've done this a lot, but we'll check back in once we've cleared out the waste. So this is where the mentality becomes a little bit different between half blind and regular through dovetails. For half blind, all you're ever gonna see is this face. No other part of these will you ever see except for this exact face here. So you wanna take special care that you get down to your line here perfectly, but when it comes to back here, nobody cares. So as long as you don't go over your rabbet, it doesn't matter. So what I like to do, the great thing that you saw about this rabbet is that it's a perfect depth line and it's also 90 degrees to your other faces. So what I like to do is before I start working on the face, I'll just give these just a little bit of a cleanup down to the rabbet, and that way I know that I'm not gonna blow it out from the front when I start cleaning that up. Again, it doesn't matter if you bruise your corners a little bit because this is all they're gonna see. So then I very carefully come up front and clean these out, taking just half and then half again and then half again until you're down to your line. And there we go. And that should be perfect. There we go. Now I'm gonna put this in the vise and just clean out the centers, make sure there's nothing in there that's gonna stop us from seating. I got these really cool chisels. They're actually carver's chisels, but they work really good for cleaning the inside of dovetails that are really, really small. They're really precise, and you can kind of like hold on to them so you don't really take anything out. I'll put a link down to the description for them, but they are one of those things that you didn't know you needed until you had them, and they are really, really helpful. And they just help you get just the little stuff out of the middle. Now, I always recommend working from your show face back when you're doing final cleanup. That way, if anything happens, it's on the side that nobody's ever gonna see. So, I'm just gonna get these cleaned out. And you can even dig these out more than you would think. You need to, just because again, they're not gonna show. Now I'm gonna go ahead and use my dovetail alignment board, which is really helpful for marking out. I sell a version I make on the CNC on my website. That's linked below as well. We're gonna go ahead and put this in the vise and start marking these out. And one of the great things, again, about this rabbet, another thing I've said a whole bunch of times, is that it helps you with marking out an alignment because it seats perfectly with your board. So you just press it down and you don't have to line it up yet. You just want your pin board pressed up against the fence of your dovetail alignment board. You just press it down till you feel it go flat, and then you just lock it into your vise. Then you push your tail board up against the fence, making sure everything's seating right. If you don't have a dovetail alignment board, I recommend just taking a square or ruler and making sure that those are flush. And then very carefully, you want to mark out. You can do a light mark all the way through, but I would recommend just trying to get to your depth line, and you should have already marked this out with your marking gauge, but you could also, if you didn't, mark out the top of your tails as well. But we already did with our marking gauge, so that's not necessary. Okay, now here is where marking out gets a little different than dovetails. So what you can do, slide your square over to your line and mark down to your depth gauge. And that's going to give you a great guide for your saw and your chisels. I'm doing this backwards for your guys' benefit, so I hope you appreciate that. Now we're going to cut out our pins, but here's something if you're using a jig, any jig for that matter, not just mine, is that of course all saws have tooth set, which means the tooth sticks out further than the saw. So if you were to use this to cut the pins, it would perfectly line up, no problem, but you're going to be dragging your teeth across the face of your jig, which is going to scratch it up. And that would happen to any guide you are using. So there's a couple solutions here. One, you can cut it out by hand and just, you know, stay further away from your line than you normally would. Or you can use either blue tape, or there's this really cool stuff called UHMW. It's made out of the same stuff that the white cutting boards are made out of. And it's clear and it's super anti-friction. It's super slick. I'm gonna put this on my jig. We're gonna do both. We're gonna cut it out by hand and we're gonna use the tape just so we can try both. But again, all that matters is that top face. So as long as you stay away from your line there and chisel to it last, you will be fine, I promise. Now, when we make these cuts, because we're not cutting all the way through, you can only cut to the top corner and the bottom corner. So you're essentially going to be cutting at like an angle like this, and you need to stop when you get to those corners, and then everything's going to have to be cleared out with something other than a saw. So just make sure you don't go past either one of your marking gauge lines, and then I'll show you how to clear it out here at the end. Okay, so now we have our pins cut the best we can with that angle. I found that using the jig to get the kerf started and then sort of taking it away and working my way just down, up, really helped. But this is such a small kerf that, you know, I really recommend that you just use the jig to get it started and then use your eye and you can chisel down to it later. So we need to clear out this waste. There's several ways you could do it. Matt Cremona, I've seen do it with a Forstner bit, clear out a lot of the waste and then do the rest with a chisel. I think we're going to do the whole thing with a chisel because that's just going to be a little bit easier given the size of these. So we're going to start on the back face because this is the most important. We'll do this line after we've cleared out a lot of waste. That way it doesn't screw up our depth gauge. So we're going to start on this side here. Here's a good little tip here if you haven't already, especially when you're looking at a board from this way. It's almost impossible to tell which is your waste and which isn't. So make sure you just mark your waste out so you don't chisel the wrong piece out. And then we're going to go ahead and start chiseling. Guys, one of the things to think about is never put your hand in front of a chisel. I know it feels like you want to hold this down and dig this out, but I have stuck my hand with a chisel too many times to let you do that, so be careful. One of the things I'm going to do to make sure this is safer is just clamp it to my bench. That way I don't need to get in front of it. And then I'm just going to start digging out material here. One of the things you can do, a great little trick I used to use, is you can use a piece of wood as a 90-degree guide. But again, this is the inside, doesn't really matter. This will be all covered by the rabbit. You'll never, ever see this. So alternate between chopping down and chopping out. If you're having any trouble fitting your piece, you can easily dig out where you think it is. So if you go to set your piece and it's not going down, you can easily dig out just the middle of your pin section, no problem. So again, because these aren't seen, if you're having any trouble fitting, just wherever you think that is, you just can dig that area out. One of the things you can do for glue up that will help you with getting it to seat, and again, be real careful, use your fingers as a brake here, but you can just take in the inside corners. Make sure you're on the rabbit side of your dovetails. You can just take those in, just chamfer them just a little bit, and that will help you get it to seat, just like that. Now, because this wall's so thin, and I've had it happen before, I'm going to clamp a sacrificial board back here just so that when I hammer this home, it doesn't blow apart. It's not mandatory, but just take it from a guy who's had these things blow out before. All right, guys, well, that came out great. This is a utilitarian joint. One thing to know is I did misspeak when I was setting the depth line in the walnut for my maple. I measured the thickness of the board when really I should have measured the thickness of the board after the rabbet. So small mistake, it was so thin, it was 1/16 of an inch. It just took me an extra minute to take that off with a hand plane. But honestly, this came out absolutely gorgeous, and I'm really excited. Next week, we're gonna do inlaid half-blind dovetails, which is really exciting. So we'll see you next week on Join of the Week. If you're new here, please subscribe. We'd love to have you. Thanks so much for watching, guys. Stay safe in the shop and have a wonderful day. I'm Jonathan Katz-Moses, and on this week's Joint of the Week, we're going to do the three-way locking miter. Now, this is the hardest Joint of the Week I've ever done. This took me 4 practice tries this week to get it right, but I am so happy with the way it came out. I learned a lot about using hand tools, and it really was the most fun I've ever had doing Joint of the Week. It's got 3 tenons, 2 through mortises, 1 stopped mortise, a bunch of 45-degree cuts. You get to use the handsaw a lot. I use the drill press to clear out some waste. So let me show you how I get started. Okay, so here's a practice one that I did, and I cut off the ends so you can, I'll use these as demonstration devices throughout the video so that you can kind of see what pieces I'm doing and what I'm working on before I get started, so you can kind of see. This is a very complicated joint, and so I want as much visual aid as possible. But the way that they work is you have, we'll call this component 1, 2, and 3. 2 and 3 go together like that, and then slide into component 3, locking everything down. That hole was a mistake, so don't look at that. But it's got 2 through tenons and 1 stopped mortise and tenon. And then to do these, it's mostly hand tools because you really can't get in here with power tools. I do use a drill press to clear out a lot of waste in some, but mostly I'm just using chisels. You're going to use your marking gauge a lot. A marking knife and speed square and a dovetail saw work great for this. You could also use a Tsugi, but any saw that you're comfortable using is going to work great. To get started, we need to have square stock. This needs to be square because you do different things to different pieces that need to be the same on both sides. So make sure you have square stock. And we're going to go ahead and start with component 1. This is by far the hardest. And then everything you do, you're going to measure off of this piece. So you use your marking gauge to see how far the tenon is for laying out your mortise over here. So we get started with this one. Take great care to ensure it's all correct. But I think if you follow the steps that I have here, it's going to be a lot easier than you think. So the first step is you need to mark a line down that is as wide as your piece. So the way I do that, take my marking gauge and just set it flush with my piece, taking great care to ensure that's flush, and then go around and we're going to mark out all our pieces, every side. Just like that. Now we're going to focus our attention on piece 1 here, on the layout. Now the first step is going to be to lay out these 1/4 inch walls right here. And so the way I do that, most good speed squares are going to have indentations in the lines here. It's a good tip for any project you're doing. And what I do is I put the cutter in the 1/4 inch mark and then lock down my square. And that's going to ensure that you're perfectly in a 1/4 inch. And you can't feel this on the video, but it's locked in there. So then what I'm going to do is mark out down the top and down the face. And that's going to give me my cut line for these pieces right here. And you're only going to mark down one face. Next thing is going to be to mark out the insides of our tenons. Now, because we're going to use a 1/4 inch drill bit to clear out this waste, I'm going to just do a little bit more than a 1/4 inch. So what we're going to do, since we already have a 1/4 inch and we need a 1/4 inch in between, we're going to do a 1/2 inch plus a 1/16. 9/16 for you playing the home game. Again, we're going to go down the face of our board here on both sides. So we're going to go all the way across the top and then down the face, down to our line here. And now we need to mark the outsides of our tenon here, and because we added that little 1/16 in there, we're going to do 3/4 of an inch plus a 1/16, And the reason, again, is we can use that same 1/4 inch drill bit to drill out the waist of our tenon. And again, we're gonna mark the top and down one face here. See, we're starting to get a grid pattern here, and these are gonna end up being all our saw lines for clearing out this waist. Okay, now we have our tenons marked out, which are here and here. And this one we're gonna leave longer than this one, so this is gonna be 2 separate measurements here. But I'm gonna leave this one 1/2 inch, and this one is gonna be just over a 1/4 inch square. So again, we're gonna go to our square here. I'm gonna lock that in. I'm gonna mark it across our face here and up the side. And then for this guy over here, same thing. We're gonna go just over a 1/4 inch. So 1/4 and a 1/16. I'm gonna use a dark pencil here and really mark out what I'm keeping here, because that's gonna be important for the end here. All right, now that we have our grid marked out of saw lines, we're gonna come over here. We need to mark out a 45-degree line with our marking knife, and the tops of them are gonna intersect in the same corner. So there we go. You can see we have 2 lines there. They intersect in this corner, which is going to end up looking like this piece here. Now it's time to start sawing and clearing out waste. So here we go. Okay, so we're done with number 1, and that one is the hardest. That one you really want to get right, because everything else, like I said, measures off of it. So we're going to get started on component 2, which has a through mortise as well as a full-size tenon. We're going to come in here, and this, as you can see, is going to interfere with this tenon. So we're just going to cut this one in half, and honestly, it doesn't matter where it happens. So just cut that one anywhere, because you're going to drill on component 3, your mortise is going to get drilled all the way through to the tenon. That's the way I find it to be easy. So you don't really have to worry about the height of this one as long as it doesn't interfere with this guy. And so this one is going to have this piece here that fits into this area. So you're going to cut off this 45-degree section, but you're also going to make a 90-degree cut like we did here. And we're going to cut out our tenon and then cut down from both sides, which will give us this 45, which will eventually end up fitting into piece 3 like that, and then going on to piece 1. So we're going to go ahead and get started. We're not going to have to use the drill press for anything but the mortise. I like to cut my mortise small and then size my tenon to fit in there. Just you're going to get a lot tighter fit. I was struggling really hard when I was doing these with getting the tenons to fit in there tightly. So I'm going to start with a much smaller mortise and then fit my tenon to it. So it's going to take a little bit longer, but it'll be great. So let me show you how I lay this out. Okay, so we've got piece 2 fit up, and man, is it fitting good. I really like the fact that I cut the mortise a lot smaller and then sort of sized it. That solved some problems I was having earlier when I was trying to cut this joint. Now piece 3, 2 mortises. One is a through mortise, one is a stopped mortise. It's gonna have one saw cut here, and then you can make this cut on the table saw with a 45-degree sled or with your miter gauge. So we're gonna get in, I'm gonna lay out the through mortise first, get it all cut, and then I'm just gonna drill out this guy. This one you'll never see in the finished piece, so it really doesn't matter too much. I mean, you don't wanna make it too loose, but don't stress over the stop mortise too much. So let me show you how I lay that out and get it cleared. Okay, so we've got everything put together. Now it's time to start fitting it up, and this is no easy task, but that's okay. We're gonna start by putting piece 2 and 3 together, and oh man, that looks awesome. Okay, so check this out, guys. We've got a little gap here that's the same on both of these. So we've got this same gap here, which means we can take just some off of both sides of these, just on the bottom, and we can get them to drop down, and everything's still gonna fit the same. It's not gonna affect any of the tenons and mortises. So what we wanna do is measure that gap, and let's call it, it looks like it's just about a 1/16, maybe a little bit under. So what I'm gonna do, I'm gonna take my marking gauge here, we're gonna set it to just under a 1/16. So I'm gonna take this marking gauge here with the 3/16, and I'm gonna just mark a line here on the bottom of both of these pieces. And then we're gonna use a hand plane. In fact, I just restored a number 3 Bailey. That's our previous video. You should go check that out. I'll put a link right here in the corner. We're going to plane these down so that they fit there. So just put them in the vise like this. Then we're going to take the 100-year-old Bailey number 3 that I restored earlier this week and just shave these down. And although this is a great smoother, I think we're gonna get a plane with a more aggressive bite to it here. All right, so I think this is it. Let's check out it's gonna fit here. So everything seems to be fitting pretty good. We're gonna go ahead and put piece 2 and 3 together, and then give this one a little tappy tap tap. There we go. All right, let me get this cleaned up and get some lacquer on it so we can see what it looks like. Holy Toledo, guys. This came out so good. I'm so happy with this. This was really, really hard. And this took me a long time to get right, but I'm so happy that I persevered, because that's what Joint of the Week is about. It's about pushing yourself to be better at woodworking. So get out there in the shop and try something you're scared of. Stay safe, guys. I'll see you next week. Have a wonderful day.
Mitered joints are simple, but it doesn't mean they're easy, right? Think about it. You have 8 cuts at 45 degrees that all need to come together to make a perfect box. Now, layout lines are a lot harder to hit with an angled blade, and if you cut one board slightly shorter than another, all those errors can compound, leaving you with a big gap in a corner or two. I know we've all had that experience. And then what about grain wrapping? How do you maintain that grain wrap so it looks like one board all the way around the box? Well, today I wanted to walk you through all the tips and tricks I know for mitered joints so you can get seamless, perfect joints every time. So let's head over to the table. So I want to talk about grain wrapping first. Grain wrapping is where the wood appears to seamlessly go around all 4 sides of a box. Now, because a mitered joint doesn't show any end grain, it's a phenomenal way to do mitered boxes. It makes your box look super pro, looks really, really cool. Now, you can't do this just with one board, because if you chopped it up into 4 pieces, you're gonna have 3 matching corners, but then your 4th corner is gonna be a big mismatch. So we do it by resawing a board. And if you don't know how to do that, I have a great video called 4 Ways to Resaw a Board with and without a bandsaw. It makes resawing, you know, a little bit simpler for you. So we're gonna go ahead and get started here on a table saw. I'm gonna kind of show you how to grain wrap throughout this whole video as I show the other parts that make your miters a lot better. So stick with me here and we'll get through it all the way to glue up, and you'll see exactly how I get that grain wrap. All right, so this is how this layout works, is I have a side and then a front, and then it wraps just like the name, a side and a front. And you can see the side doesn't line up with the front, so we need to resaw it obviously before we cut these pieces. I have, like I said, a great video on how to resaw. I'm going to do this on the table saw by marking the center of my board. This is really easy to do with a marking gauge. I just guess at center, and then I'll take my marking gauge from one side and then the other, and you can see that is going to be the center right in between those lines. And because your blade is whatever thickness, 1/8 or 3/32, just want to shoot for middle, because you're going to end up planing this anyways, so they're going to end up being the exact same size. You want to just take a little bit at a time. I like to take 3/4 of an inch at a time, flip my board, ensuring my same face is against the fence over here, flip it again, raising the blade another 3/4 of an inch till we get almost to the middle. You don't want to take the middle, because then you just have a board that partway through your cut is going to be released. So cut almost to the middle, and then you can just break it off, and that'll just come off in the planer when you plane it. So let's resaw these boards. We'll talk about our next step, which will be cutting them up. All right, so of course in the planer we lost our markings, so I wrote it on the top edge. That way I would remember which way everything went and then relabel them when they came out. This is important because when you resaw a board, it's going to match in every direction, both up, down, left, right, back, front, but you need to remember which order they go in. We are now going to remove our pieces. We need to remember that the things we do to one board, we have to do to the other in the same order. And so I put in my 60-tooth CMT thin curve blade that we carry over at kmtools.com. We're going to cut these at 90 degrees now. We're not going to cut our miters yet, but I'm going to show you a way to get a perfect miter without losing any more material after this 90-degree cut. So we're going to use a stop block, also over at kmtools.com. These videos are not sponsored and supported by viewers like you heading over to our website, so I really appreciate you go checking it out. We're going to set up our stop block, and what that means is here you can see this is the way our boards are going to go. They match this way, and they also match this way. Look, exact same thing both ways. And so what we're going to do, you can see that the side piece is the first cut here. So we're going to do that cut to release them. We're going to set our stop block at the correct distance, and we're going to do both the same way with the same edge facing against your fence. Once we do that, we'll get out our miter sled and do the 45. All right, my next tip is get one of these digital angle finders. This is the one we carry on our website. Lots of companies make them. I'll link ours down below, but get one. It's a game changer for you. The other thing too, here's a great tip from Chris Salamone and Sean Boyd, which is if you undercut your miters like 49.99 degrees, if there is an error, it's going to be moved to the inside of the joint, not the outside. So if you undercut them just slightly, that can help you with some air, but these digital angle finders are amazing and I love them. real accurate and helps you get perfect cuts. My next tip is over on the crosscut sled for how to remove material without losing any material. Okay, whenever I need to make a miter that really counts for some, you know, real nice box I'm making or anything, I like to make a new zero clearance insert. And the reason is when you're using your sled, you know, you could have had thick kerf and full kerf blades and different types of teeth, and you end up with a kerf that is not a zero clearance. So you may have some blowout at the end of your miter, and it's really hard to line this cut up with a tilted blade. So all you need to do is take a sacrificial piece of wood like this and some double stick tape, and then you're gonna cut through it once with the blade already tilted exactly where you want it to be, and that's gonna show you how to line up your cut. So now this is where it makes cutting your miters perfect and seamless, right? So I can take this back corner and line it up perfectly with that line, and I know I'm not gonna lose any of my grain wrap, and I'm gonna keep as much material as possible. Then I'm gonna take a stop block here, and we're not gonna move this until we've done both of our long pieces, both D and B, because that's gonna ensure these pieces stay the exact same length. So what we're gonna do is make a cut on this side without moving the stop block, rotate it around, and then we're gonna do this side, same thing with B, and that will ensure, because one of the ways that people get gaps is their pieces end up getting different lengths, even by just a tiny amount. So let's make these cuts. We're then gonna do the same thing with our shorter pieces. We're just gonna line that corner up right with that edge and make both cuts, and then we'll have a box that's ready for glue up. So as you can see, we've maintained our grain wrap, and it is time to glue these boxes up. Now, this is one of those times where you don't really need clamps. You can use clamps to pull it into square, but the best way to do it is blue tape. And I'm gonna take you over to my assembly table and show you. But the way I get this started so that my box glues up really even is I use a straight edge, like my table saw fence. So I push everything right up against my table saw fence, make sure everything lines up, make sure it's nice and flat against there, and then I'll take a few pieces of blue tape and put them across the pieces just like this. And there's a little bit more to do, which we will do at the assembly table, but this is a great way to ensure that everything stays together in the right way and you get a real nice successful glue up here. One of the things you really want to watch out for when you're doing this is this from up top can look like they're together, but it's actually kind of up above. That's a real extreme version of it, but it can even be just a little bit. So this is why a table saw or your crosscut sled is a great place to do this, because you know this is super flat and your table is flat. So if you push down on them real good and push them together and then also push against your fence, you're going to get them to line up just perfectly. Once you have these nice and straight, I like to add some tape that goes across the first piece of tape. It just gives a little bit of added strength and stability. You don't want a piece of tape coming off in the middle of a glue up. Then once you have that done, what I like to do, it's not necessary by any means, is I like to take tape and put it on the inside of my miters, because that is where all your squeeze out is going to go, and this saves you a heck of a lot of cleanup time later. And the way I do it is I put it straight across that line. You want to make sure you're not in your miter at all, so you want to be even like just a hair's width outside your miter, and then you don't want any tape getting in the way of your glue up being flat. So then once I have them all taped, I'll flip it over, and taking like a razor blade or my marking knife, I will trim that piece off so that it looks like this and is very nice and clean. You don't want to go crazy with glue in these because it's going to squeeze out all over the place. So let's get this ready for glue up, and I'll show you all the tricks for getting a perfect glue up. Okay, now we have everything ready, and what we're gonna do is we're gonna just put a little bit of glue, because remember, these are gonna get real tight, and then look at how satisfying this is. Boom, just folds up into a perfect square. At the end, we're gonna throw blue tape on this. You see some clamps here. Those are gonna be to pull it into square if needed. I'm gonna show you how to check for that, and just to make sure that last joint is closed up if you like. Blue tape has a little tiny bit of elasticity to it, so it actually gives pretty good clamping pressure. So when I say a little bit of glue, I mean just a little bit of glue. It's going to really get tight in there, so you just want to get just enough to fill your joint. and create just a tiny bit of squeeze out. You'll see, like, look at this. I'm gonna squeeze this here. See a little bit of squeeze out there. You're gonna get a good joint regardless. So you just wanna get a little bit of glue. And the great part about having this blue tape here is that you don't have to be too clean with it here. You can get a little bit sloppy, you know? Get a little messy. You can feel it even get tighter here because now you have glue in those joints. So when you get to this last one, you really want to make sure those corners are lined up before you put your tape on there. I like to wipe away any excess glue here just so that it stays clean up later. And when you pull it down, you want to kind of stretch it. Now, if we did everything right, we should have a square box. Now, the easiest way to check for square is to go corner to corner with a ruler, 23.5 centimeters, 23.5 centimeters. Should be right. You can check with a square. Yeah, that box is really, really square. So we're gonna set that aside to dry. One of the ways to fix this, if you were out of square, is you can take a clamp and put it on the corners like this and pull it into square. This one is really square here, so we don't have to do that. We're gonna go ahead and let this dry. You wanna be careful of your squeeze out on the bottom here. You can see I got squeeze out in my corners. So you can clean that up now if you want. Save you a little bit of hassle later. Make sure it's not dripping. We're gonna set that aside to dry and do our last box. We got tape off, everything is clean, it's looking really good. Wait till we throw some finish on, you'll really see how this grain wrap came out, but it looks really good. Everything's super clean because we put that tape on the corners. The inside's really clean. If you gotta clean up a corner, you use something like this glue scraper or a chisel, get any last little remaining things. You know, one of the things I forgot to say is before you do glue up, it's real good to lightly sand the inside with like some 150. Usually the inside of boxes aren't that visual, so you don't need to go crazy on the sanding, but it is good to sand the inside of things before glue up just to save yourself a little bit of time and hassle when you're finishing because it's hard to get in there once it's all glued up. So let's head over to the bench. I'm going to show you how to clean up your miters and how to fix gaps if you have them. Okay, now first you're going to want to start by cleaning up the tops and bottoms of your box. I've already cleaned this one up with a block plane. The other way to do it would be to take a sheet of sandpaper and sand it lightly. You want to attach your sandpaper with like a little spray adhesive and make sure that it's on a flat surface. And then you would just go slowly. You want to be careful you're not putting too much pressure on one side of the box. You want to go around in a circular motion. That works really good. I think the most accurate way to do that would be with a block plane. Now you want to be careful that you're not going off the side because when you get to the edge of your miter, it's going to cause blowout. It's never good to go this way. So what I like to do is I will go turn with the boards just like this. So I'll kind of clean up, get to the middle, just sort of do my corners, and then when I get to a final pass here, I come around like this. And this will give you nice clean corners. Do a few passes just to clean up the corner closest to me, and then I'll skip over and do the same thing here. And then I'll start in the middle and just kind of turn the corner with my hand plane. And that way I'm not blowing out your edges. Nothing is more frustrated than after a glue up ruining a piece because it took so much work to get there. But look at that. That was, I mean, a total of 30 seconds and that is very cleaned up. Now, when you get to the edges or the sides, same thing. You could use your sander, or if you are confident with your hand plane, you can use that. What you want to do is check your grain direction, right? And the good thing is with a grain wrap, and this is going to look a lot better here in a second, the grain wrap, is you can see that the board is like one continuous board. So once you figure out which grain you need to be planing with, you can just continue to spin the box in that direction. You're always going to be going with the grain. I can see my grain comes off this way, so I'm going to plane this way, so that way I'm going correctly with the grain. Okay, now I'm gonna show you a clip here. I made this jewelry box and I had a gap in one of the trays. And a great way to fix this, you take anything round, because any steel is gonna be harder than wood. So like your screwdriver, take like this part of the handle of your chisel, especially if it's longer than that one, or a burnisher, and you're just gonna roll your edges over like this. And this is going to fix any gap to make it look really seamless. And then it's time to clean up your corners. The other thing too is if you have a gap that's really big, you can do glue and sawdust and kind of push it in there, make that corner like the back of your box. But you can see just rolling it over makes a really, really big difference. And then to clean it up, you can use a block plane, but the thing is you don't want to go all the way through because you can get tear out up here. So just count your strokes and go around in a circle like this, and then same thing, you come back the other way. And you get a nice rounded corner. The other thing you could do is a little sandpaper, is you just go around like this. A broken rounded corner, that's what they call it, breaking the corners when you take the edge off, is gonna look so much better in a finished piece and give it that sort of tactile feel that makes a big difference. So we're gonna go ahead and clean up all these other corners, including this box. We're gonna throw some finish on here so you can really get kind of the full effect of that grain wrap and see how cool that actually looks. All right, we got some finish on there. I put some Rubio, which we also carry in our store. In fact, everything I use from this video, I'm gonna put on Memorial Day sale since Memorial Day is tomorrow in the US. So everything in this video and a few other things will be on sale over on our website. I'll link that down below in the pinned comment. Now, these are what I would call perfect miters. They really are, they came out great. And if you can see how cool this grain wrap is, we'll do a close up here. It just is continuous and it makes your box look absolutely incredible. It's really a good way to do it. So miters are, like I said at the beginning, they are simple to do, but getting perfect miters is not simple. And if you use some of the tips and tricks we talked about in this video, I think you can have a lot of success with these joints, and they are phenomenally beautiful. One of the things you can do too, because miters, especially the bigger you get, the less strong they are, is you can add splines. This is a test piece from a video I did called 4 Ways to Do Mitered Splines. A lot of cool ways to do those. You can really use those to make your box your own. You can make them different widths and heights and all these things and create like a really cool pattern. Really fun way to reinforce miters. Guys, as always, thanks for watching. What's up, guys? This week on Joint of the Week, we're going to do a through wedge mortise and tenon. This is a beautiful piece of joinery that works really well in furniture. Really, anytime you have a mortise and tenon, it's a great way to make it very decorative. And there's lots of ways that you can vary the look. You can vary the direction of the wedge, or you can use a contrasting piece of wood to help kind of showcase the joint. It's a Japanese style joint, and I think I'm going to show you a pretty easy way to do it. We're going to make our wedge go down vertically, which I think is probably my favorite look, and we're going to cut a really cool wedge and give some detail to the piece. So let's get started over on the drill press. So we have 3 components to this joint. We have your mortise material. This would be like the leg in your furniture. We have our tenon material. This would be like the stretcher, and then we have our wedge material. Now I'm using contrasting woods, so at the end we can see where everything is and how it works together. What woods you choose, that's going to be up to you. So we need to do some calculating here. Our tenon material is going to go through our mortise material, and our wedge is 1/2 inch wide. We are going to drill a hole through the mortise that leaves enough stick out that we can stick our wedge in, have it be decorative. We can chamfer these edges, and so we need to calculate that. And so what we do is we figure out the width of our leg piece. So that's 1 3/4. And so this we know needs to stick through at least 1 3/4. I'm going to want my wedge, which is going to go through here, to take up about half the space, and then the stick out take out
take up about half the space. So I'm gonna have my wedge be about 1/2 inch deep. And so I want this to stick out 1 inch. So we need to go back 2 3/4. That's gonna be the shoulder of our tenon. So that's really easy to do. You can take a pair of calipers or a ruler and set it to 2 3/4. And then you can take a marking gauge and use it to lay out your shoulder by taking your calipers just like this. We'll verify that, make sure that that's 2 3/4. It's almost. There we go. So now that we have that at 2 3/4, we're going to mark out the shoulder of our tenon. And this doesn't have to be too dark right now because you can darken it up with your marking knife. But we just want to get a reference area. Make sure that lines up all the way around. Okay, so now we know that the shoulder of our mortise is going to come to here, just like that. Now what we need to do is mark out where our tenon is going to come through. We know that our mortise is going to stick through 1 3/4, so I'm going to just mark that out roughly because we don't really care, we just kind of want to know where it is. So that's where our board is going to be. And so when we do our mortise, what we want to do is go back just a little bit so that we don't overshoot. We're going to do it like that. So the way I'm going to lay that out, so I have here a 1/2 inch Forstner bit, which is, as you can see, the same width as our wedge material. And so I want to identify a center line because the tip of that Forstner bit is going to register in that center line. We know that we want it 1/2 inch past the wedge, so we can mark that out with our marking knife. And we'll do it on a fresh side here. We'll mark it with a pencil first here. So that's where our mortise is going to finish. And we know we need to go back at least 1 inch, if not, we'll call it 1 1/8 inches, just so that we make sure we're totally embedded in the mortise, in the leg. So we need to go back at least to there. So we're going to drill out this area and then chop it out with a chisel. And so we need to identify a center line in our piece for our Forstner bit to register in. So we're at 1.3 here, which is going to be 0.65 will be our center line. And you could easily do that with a ruler as well. I just find calipers make it a lot easier. So then I'm going to identify that center line there. Make sure we're correct. Yep. So that's going to be a perfect point for our Forstner bit to register in when we're clearing out material. And because we're going to be roughly 1/2 inch, it's going to be easy to clear out that material. So what I'm going to do now is we're going to make these lines sharper across. This one you can go all the way across because it's going to be buried inside your mortise. You'll never see it, so you can be a little bit darker with that. And then for this guy, we're going to measure out 1/4 inch from each side of our line, just like this. And then you can darken that up. And that's going to give you a stopping point for your mortise. Same thing over here. And you can see why I do this where I hold the marking knife and then slide the square up to it in the Essential Skills for Woodworkers series. I'll put a link here in the corner. And so now we've marked out our wedge hole. Go ahead and darken this line up as well. So now we're going to clear out this area right here. And we're going to do this very simply by using a Forstner bit to clear out a majority of the waste and then using a chisel to cut out the rest. And remember, our shoulder line's all the way back here, so this area in here is going to be buried in the mortise. So we're going to clear out this area first, then we're going to go cut our mortise and then fit the tenon to it. We want our wedge material to fit in this hole first, then we cut our mortise into our leg piece, and then we fit our tenon to it. I find that way you get a lot more accurate results. So let's clear out this waste. Okay, so now I'm going to go ahead and transfer these lines to the other side so that we have a square reference on both sides to chop to. So And this is really easy because you can essentially just take your marking gauge and set the wheel in the marking knife line you created before, snug it up, tighten it up, and you're right in the same line. And this gives us a great knife line for the other side. And this will be the bottom side. There we go. And this one doesn't matter because this is buried in the mortise anyways, but just give me a reference area to stop at. Okay, let's get to chopping. Okay, so we have the mortise for our wedge cut out. We paid very close attention to this edge and these two edges to make sure they were parallel and square. And now we're going to go ahead and cut our mortise. And our mortise is going to be a 1" by 1" square mortise, so we're going to head over to the drill press and cut that out with a Forstner bit. When you're cutting a mortise, remember the inside doesn't matter very much because the shoulder of your piece is going to cover it. So as long as your shoulder is square, the inside can be just ugly as you want. You want to just pay very close attention that you do the outside of it right. And all you need to do is get that 1" by 1" square perfectly marked out and cut with a marking knife line. As long as you don't go over those marking knife lines, you're going to be just fine. So I'm going to go ahead and mark this out and then we'll head over to the drill press. It's time to set the distance with a stop block to the edge of our cheek and not move it. We're going to be using this, the Katz-Moses no deflection stop block on pre-sale on my website. When you're measuring, it's important to measure from the outside of your piece, the show side of your piece. And it seems counterintuitive, but that's where you want it to fit. The inside you can adjust. The inside doesn't matter because it's going to get covered by the cheeks. So you want to make sure that the end of your tenon is fitting into the outside portion of your mortise on this. And so we're going to go ahead, now that we have our height set, we're going to set our stop block and cut this out, and then we're going to adjust the height for the other side and get everything fitting really well. All right, we've got everything fitting up nice. It's time to cut our wedge and then get everything sanded up and put together. The reason you want your tenon to fit so tightly is that you're gonna have to sand it just a little bit, take the saw marks out. And so you don't wanna leave those if you can avoid it. And if you sand it, obviously you're gonna make it smaller. So you want it to be fitting really nice and tight before you go into your final finish. So we're gonna go ahead and cut our wedge, get everything sanded up and put it together. Whoa, that came out good. I am so happy. So this is actually called a Tusked mortise and tenon. It's when you stick a wedge in from the top. It's called a Tusked mortise and tenon, just for you guys playing the home game. Really great joint. This thing looks so cool. I love the way it just sucks everything up super tight, so you get no gaps. Everything's super tight, really clean joinery. No clamps whatsoever. There's no glue in this whatsoever. And one thing I would suggest is whatever you use for your wedge, make sure it's softer than your tenon board, because one or the other is going to give, and you want it to be your wedge when you start pounding things home. I love this look. I'm going to use this on some furniture. Guys, stay safe in the shop. I will not do a butt joint, and have a wonderful day.